Hi, Maggie. Yes, it's a big day for survivors of Epstein and survivors of all sexual abuse. And before I address your question about the length of it took the jury to return, I wanted to acknowledge that and say that I have personally spoken with our client, Sarah Ransom, and several other survivors that I met in the course of the trial. And I know that others in our firm have spoken with our clients, and to a person, they've expressed gratitude, great relief. Um, they've spoken especially about a burden having been lifted from their shoulders. They're still they feel that they have for once been heard, and so I think that we need to stop and acknowledge the significance of this verdict for all survivors of child sexual abuse. Also, I wanted to express gratitude for the hard work of so many people that made this possible. First and not foremost, but first the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. They worked tirelessly. They were under extraordinary pressure to bring Miss Maxwell to justice. They were criticized in the course of the trial for not doing it exactly the way others might have done it. They kept it focused, in my view. They appropriately kept it focused on several key victims, and that strategy proved to be correct. Also, I wanted to shout out for all of the civil lawyers, including all the lawyers in the firm of Marsh Law Firm, as well as others who worked over the last number of years to bring this to the attention of authorities in the world. And two people in particular need to be identified here, and that is Brad Edwards and Paul Cassell, who were the lawyers who brought this initially to everybody's attention down in Florida more than 10 years ago. They really are the unsung heroes in this story, and I want to give them a big shout out. Now, that's a long-winded preliminary to answering your question. Why did it take the jury so long, if you will? It took them 5 days to return a verdict on 5 of the 6 counts. 5 days is a little longer than, in my experience, is normal for a two-week, 2-day trial. My rule of thumb would have usually it take a jury about a little over 2 days to do that. In this case, it took 5. I'd point out it seemed like it took even longer because they did take a 4-day recess. They deliberated 2 days, took 4 days off, and came back and took 3. And I know that a lot of people were very anxious and nervous by the time they returned their verdict. And then finally, I guess I would say that there's other reasons that it took them longer than I would expect or normal, if you would. Primarily, we have to remember that Miss Maxwell was not the primary perpetrator. She was certainly an important manager or lieutenant for Epstein, but she wasn't the primary perpetrator. And there was no evidence presented that she was actually in the massage rooms when he was sexually abusing these girls. And that made the case a little more complicated from a prosecutorial perspective because they had to present circumstantial evidence to prove her knowledge. And knowledge really was the critical issue. Did she know what was happening in those massage rooms behind closed doors? And to do that, the prosecution presented really a lot of circumstantial evidence without detailing it all. There was the fact that Epstein, over the course of the conspiracy, which ran about 10 years, paid Miss Maxwell $30.5 million. There was all of the pictures that they uncovered in the searches of the mansions around the world showing their close connection. There was a testimony that for many of the years in the conspiracy, they were intimate partners. There was testimony that in one case, she handed one of the victim girls a schoolgirl's uniform and told her that Mr. Epstein would like her to wear that to the massage. There was evidence of her uh, instructing the girls on how to massage his feet. And the totality of that evidence was enough to convince the jury. The other thing you have to remember is that there were delays in the reporting by the victims. The four victims, all in some fashion or another, delayed to report the abuse. And I think it took the jury some time to get their minds wrapped around how this could happen. There was testimony by an expert called by the government to explain how this can happen, and does happen most of the times in sexual abuse victims. And in fact, in my firm's own practice, we find that to happen virtually all the time. So I suspect that took some talking among the jurors when they got into the jury room to come to become comfortable with that idea. And eventually they did. And the other thing I would say is that the jurors showed that they took this job that they were given very seriously. They asked for things. They sent out notes asking for a whiteboard to write on. They asked for Post-it notes. They asked for a yellow magic marker. They asked for testimony or transcript of the testimony of, I think, about 10 plus witnesses. And they asked questions about the jury instruction, for instance, what the word enticed meant in the instruction. And so they took that job very seriously. And for 12 people to go through all that evidence and sort through it and talk among themselves, it can take some time. And then finally, there was the fact that there were 6 charges. And although each of the charges had the essential ingredient of sexual abuse or trafficking in sexual conduct, each of them had somewhat different elements. And so they had to go through each of those charges one by one, each of the elements, and each charge had 3 or 4. And they had to get unanimity with respect to all of them. So all things considered, I think, given the circumstances of this case, 5 days is understandable and an appropriate time for it to take for a jury to reach the verdict that they did in this case. I doubt it, and let me explain why. Under the sentencing law applied in federal cases, um, even if Ms. Maxwell were then convicted of the two conspiracy, I'm sorry, the 2 perjury charges, which, just to back up, were severed. They were in the original indictment returned by the grand jury, but the defense asked that they be severed and tried separately, which they were. So these 2 perjury charges remain untried. And even if she were convicted on those counts, it would likely not increase her sentence, at least not significantly. Um, on the other hand, under these circumstances, the government may feel that they can't cut her any break, so to speak. And it would also be something of a backstop in the unlikely event that Maxwell's appeal on the sex trafficking charges succeeds. Well, it'll be interesting to see what the government decides to do. I spent some time this morning looking into the law of sentencing, which is the sentencing guidelines. Under the federal sentencing regime, these guidelines, as they suggest, guide courts in imposing sentences. And in this case, because these are serious charges, the most serious being the trafficking in minors, in particular Caroline, one of the victims. The sentencing guidelines provide with certain adjustments because I think she'll be found to be a manager, and there was underage girls involved and multiple girls. All of those combined, and the fact that she has not admitted responsibility for the crime, all of that is going to lead to a sentencing guideline conduct number of 41. Just to give you an idea of how significant or high that is, the highest that anyone under the sentencing guidelines can get for conduct is a 43. The other factor that goes into sentencing in the federal system is the criminal history of the defendant. In this case, as far as we know, Ms. Maxwell has no criminal history, which will help her. But given the seriousness of the offense conduct, by my calculations, she's looking at a sentence between 27 and 32 or 33 years. And she would, if she doesn't pose any difficulties to prison officials, would be entitled to a reduction over the years of about 12.5%. Bottom line is she's really looking at serving 25 to 30 years in a federal custody. She's already spent a year and a half in custody waiting trial. So at the my calculations, it's at the least she's got another 23 years to serve. Right. So the federal prison system has different gradations, if you would, of prisons, from what we've heard of as the prison camps, which are the best, if you can call any place best in federal custody. They don't have set prison cells. They are in rooms or dormitories. There aren't even fences sometimes. She will not be sent to one of the prison camps because of the seriousness of her conduct and the length of the sentence that she will likely get. Also, because of the nature of her crime, that being child sex abuse, she could be viewed as a prisoner that would be at risk of being harmed by others. And then there's always the risk of suicide. And so I think at least initially she will probably be put in a middle level security facility and perhaps isolated from the rest of the population. Yes, I don't think it'll be a little prison cell where she's allowed 24 hours a day to exercise as if she were on death row. It won't be that kind of security, but it'll still be very strict restrictions on her life liberties. So I think to answer that question, you need to ask yourself two subsidiary questions. One is, is it to her advantage to squeal? And two, does the government have any interest in her squealing. Um, as far as the government's interest goes, typically the government is most interested in having a defendant talk to them and give them evidence against other targets in an investigation before a trial, number one. Number two, they're most interested where the defendant can give them evidence that is incriminating against somebody that is equal to or higher up in the criminal enterprise, if you will. In this case, from everything we know so far, Epstein was clearly at the top of the pyramid, and Maxwell was second, lieutenant, and it doesn't appear that there was anybody else her equal. There were, and there was testimony in the trial to this effect. There were several of the survivors, if you would, that eventually became recruiters themselves and worked under Maxwell and Epstein. Including, there was testimony by Carolyn that included Virginia Roberts, and several others were also mentioned. So I'm not so sure that the government has a great interest in hearing much about what she might have to give them. On the other hand, you look at, well, is it in her interest? She's steadfastly maintained her innocence, and after the verdict was returned, her attorney gave a press conference, and she reasserted her claim of innocence and claimed and said that they were already preparing an appeal. And if you decide to cooperate with the government, the first and foremost thing you have to do is admit to your guilt. So unless and until they do a 180 on that point, there's really no interest on their part, or even a possibility of the cooperating. And two, once again, given that I'm not sure that she can give the government anybody in the organization that's higher than she or Epstein, I'm not sure how much the government would credit her with cooperation, and hence the reduction in her sentence would not be all that substantial. So all that said, I don't think that it's likely she's going to decide to cooperate with the government, or that the government will have any particular interest in her doing that. Well, I would just say that it's not necessarily over. There's going to be now a sentencing phase, and in the sentencing hearing and even before, all victims will be given an opportunity to tell the court, tell the world what happened to them and how Maxwell was involved in that. So, um, and that will be more open, if you would, than the trial was. So, I guess what I hope is that the survivors, many of whom who may have never said a word to anybody, at least not publicly to this point, would come forward so that they can be heard and